December 24, 1944, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The winter air hung cold and damp over the flat Louisiana fields, but inside the corrugated steel barracks of prisoner of war Compound 3, the cold was different. It was the cold of exhaustion, of surrender, of men who had crossed an ocean not as conquerors but as captives. Outside, the cicadas had long since gone silent for the season. Inside, 214 German soldiers sat on wooden bunks, staring at nothing, their gray uniforms faded and patched. Their faces hollow with the peculiar grief of men who had survived the war, but lost everything that mattered. The sun had set an hour earlier. Through the high, narrow windows, the last threads of purple light dissolved into darkness. A single oil lamp flickered at the far end of the barroom. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Closer, the sound of boots on gravel, American guards making their rounds. The Germans did not look up. They had learned in the months since their capture that looking up changed nothing, but then something unexpected. The barracks door opened. Not with the sharp authority of a military inspection, but gently, almost hesitantly. And through that door came not soldiers, but women. 4 American nurses from the base hospital, dressed in their crisp white uniforms and navy capes, their breath visible in the cold air. They carried no weapons, no clipboards, no orders. They carried only themselves, and in the hands of the eldest among them, a small wooden pitch pipe. For a moment no one moved. The Germans stared. The nurses stood in the doorway, framed by the darkness outside, illuminated only by the single lamp. And then, without announcement, without preamble, the eldest nurse raised the pitch pipe to her lips, blew a single clear note, and began to sing. Still nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night. In German, the effect was immediate and devastating. Grown men, soldiers who had survived Normandy and the Ardennes, who had watched their comrades die in the mud of France, who had been taught that Americans were soulless capitalists, incapable of culture or compassion, these men began to weep. Not quietly, not with dignity, but with the raw, unguarded sobs of children who had been lost and suddenly heard their mother's voice calling them home. This moment, so small in the grand theater of the Second World War, would never appear in the official histories. No medal would be awarded for it. No strategic advantage would be gained. And yet, for the men who experienced it, this was the moment the war truly ended. Not on a battlefield, but in a Louisiana barracks on Christmas Eve, when enemy became human, and ideology shattered against the simple, unbearable kindness of a song. To understand why this moment held such power, we must first understand what these men had been taught to believe about America, what they expected from captivity, and what they found instead, a contrast so profound that it did not merely surprise them. It broke them, and in breaking them it rebuilt something new. The indoctrination, the men of Camp Ruston were not ordinary soldiers. Many had been members of the Africa Corps, Rommel's elite desert fighters, captured in Tunisia in May 1943. Others were veterans of the Atlantic Wall, taken prisoner during the breakout from Normandy. A smaller number were submariners, plucked from the cold Atlantic after their U-boats were depth-charged into silence. What united them was not just their nationality, but their indoctrination. From 1933 onward, the Nazi regime had constructed an elaborate mythology around the United States. America, they were told, was a nation in terminal decline, a mongrel civilization poisoned by racial mixing, controlled by Jewish financiers, and populated by weak, hedonistic cowards who cared only for material comfort. German soldiers were taught that Americans could not fight, would not fight, and that when faced with true Aryan warriors, they would collapse like the decadent French. This was not mere propaganda. It was doctrine, reinforced through every level of military training. German tactical manuals described American soldiers as individually cowardly and reliant on overwhelming material superiority to compensate for lack of fighting spirit. Newsreels showed American cities as cesspools of crime and poverty. Radio broadcasts mocked American jazz as degenerate jungle music, and Hollywood films as evidence of moral bankruptcy. When these men were captured, many expected execution. Others expected slave labor, starvation, and brutality, the same treatment they knew or suspected that prisoners received in German camps. What they did not expect, what their entire worldview had not prepared them for, was comfort, dignity, and above all, generosity. The arrival, the journey to America, was itself a revelation. Loaded onto transport ships in North African ports or English harbors, the German POWs expected the worst. The ships were crowded, yes, but they were fed. Not scraps, but rations, canned meat, white bread, and coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they had endured for years. When the ships docked in New York or Norfolk or New Orleans, the prisoners were marched through American cities, and what they saw defied comprehension. Buildings untouched by bombs. Streets filled with automobiles, thousands of them, not military vehicles but private cars, driven by ordinary citizens. Store windows overflowing with goods, clothing, radios, bicycles, food in quantities that seemed obscene. One captured officer, Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, later wrote in his diary, "I thought at first it was staged for our benefit, a Potemkin village to demoralize us. But there were too many streets, too many people, too much of everything. It was real, and if it was real, then everything we had been told was a lie." The camps themselves were another shock. Built hastily across the American South and Midwest to house the flood of Axis prisoners, these facilities were not luxury resorts, but they were not hellholes either. Barracks were clean, if sparse. Food was plentiful. The Geneva Convention mandated that POWs receive the same rations as American soldiers, and the U.S. military, with its vast agricultural and industrial capacity, could afford to comply. German prisoners ate white bread, fresh vegetables, and meat at nearly every meal. Many gained weight in captivity, a fact that bewildered and shamed them. They were paid for their labor, 80 cents per day in camp scrip, which could be used to purchase cigarettes, candy, beer, and personal items at the camp canteen. They were allowed to send letters home, though few received replies from a Germany increasingly consumed by Allied bombing and Soviet advance. They played soccer, formed orchestras, published camp newspapers, and attended classes taught by fellow prisoners. And yet, despite this relative comfort, despair was everywhere. The weight of defeat. To be a prisoner is to exist in a state of profound powerlessness. The men of Camp Rustin were safe, fed, and far from the death and chaos consuming Europe, but they were also adrift. Cut off from their families, uncertain of their fate, and forced to confront the possibility that everything they had fought for was not just lost. But wrong, this was a burden that physical comfort could not ease. Many sank into depression. Others clung to Nazi ideology with renewed fervor, as if by believing harder they could reverse the verdict of history. The camps became microcosms of Germany itself, divided between the disillusioned and the true believers. Fights broke out. Informants reported suspected defeatists to camp hardliners, who enforced loyalty through intimidation and violence. American guards were aware of these tensions, but largely powerless to stop them. The battles for Germany's soul were being fought not just in Berlin, but in the barracks of Louisiana and Texas and Kansas. By December 1944, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies had liberated Paris. The Red Army was closing on the German border. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, would soon collapse in blood and snow. The prisoners knew this, even if they did not speak of it openly. They listened to camp radios, read censored newspapers, and watched the faces of their guards. The war was ending, and Germany was losing. Christmas, then, was not a celebration but a mourning. It was the acknowledgement of absence, of home, of family, of a future that had been promised and then incinerated. In Germany, Christmas Eve was Heiligabend, the holiest night of the year, when families gathered, lit candles, sang carols, and exchanged simple gifts. Here in a Louisiana prison camp, there were no families, no candles, no gifts, only silence and the weight of memory. The nurses, the 4 women who entered the barracks that night, were not there by official order. They had volunteered, a decision that puzzled and even angered some of their colleagues. These were enemy soldiers, after all, men who had fought for Hitler, who might have killed American boys, who represented everything the war was supposed to be against. Why show them kindness? But the nurses saw something different. They saw patients, not enemies. They had spent the war caring for wounded American soldiers, and in doing so had witnessed suffering that transcended nationality. Pain was pain. Loneliness was loneliness. And Christmas, they believed, was a time when such things should be acknowledged, not ignored. The eldest of the four, Lieutenant Margaret O'Hara, was a Catholic from Boston, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had themselves once been despised outsiders in America. She had learned from her mother that mercy was not a reward for virtue, but a duty owed to all who suffered. The others, Lieutenant Sarah Kenmore, Lieutenant Evelyn Torres, and Ensign Dorothy Klein, came from different backgrounds, different faiths, different reasons. But they shared a belief that the war would end, and that what came after would depend not just on who won, but on how the winners behaved. They had practiced in secret, learning the German lyrics phonetically from a Lutheran chaplain who served the camp. They had chosen Still Nacht because it was universally known, because it was beautiful, and because it was, in its essence, a song about hope in darkness. They did not know if the prisoners would appreciate it. They did not know if they would be mocked or ignored or worse, but they sang anyway. The song Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The sound filled the barracks, soft at first, then growing as the other three nurses joined in harmony. Their voices were not professional, not operatic, but they were sincere, and in that sincerity lay their power. The German prisoners sat frozen, as if movement would shatter the moment. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at the nurses, tears streaming openly down their faces. A few began to mouth the words, then to sing them, hesitantly at first, then louder, until the barracks was filled with 200 voices in broken, aching unison. All schläft einsam wacht. All is sleeping, lonely watches. The words, written in 1818 by an Austrian priest and schoolteacher, had survived a century of wars and revolutions. They had been sung in trenches during the First World War, by soldiers on both sides of no man's land. They had been sung in German homes even as Allied bombs fell. And now they were being sung in a Louisiana prison camp, by captors and captives together, and for 3 minutes and 42 seconds the war did not exist. When the song ended, there was silence. Not the heavy silence of despair, but the stunned silence of revelation. Lieutenant O'Hara, tears in her own eyes now, nodded once to the prisoners, turned, and led the other nurses out into the night. Behind them the weeping continued, but it was different now. It was not the weeping of men who had lost everything. It was the weeping of men who had been reminded that something remained, something that could not be taken by bullets or bombs or ideologies. Humanity, connection, the stubborn, inexplicable fact that even in the darkest moments, kindness was possible. The transformation, what happened in the days and weeks that followed, cannot be measured in statistics or official reports, but it was profound. The prisoners of Camp Rustin did not suddenly renounce their nationalism or embrace American democracy wholesale. Transformation is rarely so simple. But cracks appeared in the armor of their indoctrination. Men who had refused to speak to their American guards began to ask questions about the war, about America, about what would happen when they went home. The Nazi hardliners who had dominated camp politics through fear found their influence waning. When they tried to enforce loyalty oaths or punish suspected collaborators, other prisoners intervened. The American camp commander, Colonel Raymond Weeks, noted in his report to the War Department, "A shift has occurred. I cannot explain it precisely, but the atmosphere has changed. There is less hostility, more resignation, and something else, perhaps acceptance." The nurses returned twice more before Christmas, bringing small gifts donated by local churches, socks, soap, writing paper. They did not sing again, but their presence was enough. They had proven that the enemy could be merciful without being weak, that abundance did not require cruelty, and that the values America claimed to represent, freedom, dignity, compassion, were not mere propaganda but lived realities. For the prisoners, this was more destabilizing than any battlefield defeat. A military loss could be explained, rationalized, blamed on traitors or bad luck or material disadvantage. But this generosity from those who had every right to hate them, this demanded a reckoning. Private Otto Becker, a former Hitler Youth member captured at Normandy, later wrote, "We were told that Americans were weak because they valued comfort over sacrifice. But I came to realize that we had it backward. They valued comfort because they understood that life was meant to be lived, not merely endured. We had been taught to glorify suffering, to see hardship as virtue. They had built a civilization that sought to eliminate unnecessary suffering. And in doing so, they had become stronger, not weaker. The symbolic object, throughout the months of captivity, one object came to symbolize this revelation more than any other. The white bread served at every meal. In Germany, by 1944, bread was a luxury. The civilian ration was often a dense, dark mixture of rye, sawdust, and potato flour, heavy and bitter. In the Wehrmacht, soldiers subsisted on Kommissbrot, a hard black bread that could last for weeks but was barely palatable. The prisoners arriving in America expected similar or worse. Instead, they were served soft, white, machine-sliced bread, 2 pieces at every meal, sometimes 4. At first, many prisoners hoarded it, convinced the supply would run out. But the bread kept coming, day after day, week after week, an endless stream of abundance that defied all logic. The bread became a topic of obsession. Men debated how it was made, why it was so cheap, what it meant that a nation at war could afford to feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its civilians. One prisoner, an engineer named Friedrich Baumann, began sketching plans for industrial bakeries, imagining how such systems might be replicated in a rebuilt Germany. Others simply ate, savoring each bite, marveling at the softness and the sweetness and the sheer improbable excess of it. The bread was more than food, it was evidence. Evidence that the regime they had served had lied to them about the fundamental nature of the enemy. Evidence that American prosperity was not a facade but a structural reality, rooted in systems and values entirely different from their own. Evidence that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the factories, the farms, the ideologies that shaped what kind of world each side sought to build. The epilogue, Freedom and Its Discontents, the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The men of Camp Rustin did not go home immediately. Repatriation was a slow, bureaucratic process, complicated by the devastation of Germany and the political chaos of occupation. Some prisoners remained in America until 1946, working on farms and in factories, earning money to send to families they had not seen in years. When they finally returned, they found a nation unrecognizable, cities reduced to rubble, millions dead. The Nazi state utterly annihilated, its leaders dead or on trial, its ideology exposed as monstrous. The Germany they had known was gone, and in its place was something uncertain, fragile, and haunted. But they also brought something back with them, a memory of another way. A memory of a place where abundance was normal, where enemies could be treated with dignity, where a song sung by nurses on Christmas Eve could matter more than any propaganda. These memories did not erase the crimes of the regime they had served, nor did they absolve them of responsibility, but they offered a foundation for something new. Many former prisoners became advocates for democracy in post-war Germany, using their experiences in American captivity to argue for reconciliation and reform. Others remained silent, haunted by the gap between what they had believed and what they had seen. But all of them carried, for the rest of their lives, the image of 4 women in white uniforms, standing in a cold barracks, singing a song that should not have mattered but did. Final reflection, there is a photograph, taken sometime in early 1945, of a Christmas tree erected in the center of Camp Rustin's main compound. It is not a grand tree, just a pine cut from the nearby woods, decorated with handmade ornaments and a few strings of popcorn. Around it, prisoners and guards stand together, not mingling exactly, but sharing the same space, the same moment, the same uneasy peace. The photograph is grainy, black and white, the faces indistinct. But if you look closely, you can see something in the expressions, not happiness, but perhaps relief. Relief that the war, whether on the battlefield or in the heart, might finally be ending. The nurses are not in the photograph. They had returned to their regular duties, caring for the wounded, preparing for the next wave of casualties. They did not seek recognition for what they had done, and for decades they received none. Lieutenant O'Hara died in 1972, never having spoken publicly about that Christmas Eve. The others lived longer but similarly quiet lives. Yet their legacy endured, not in monuments or medals, but in the memories of the men they had sung to. In letters sent home to Germany, in stories told to children and grandchildren, In moments of reflection when former soldiers tried to explain how they had survived not just the war, but the aftermath of discovering that everything they had fought for was a lie. The lesson of that night was not that America was perfect. It was not, and the prisoners knew it. They saw segregation, heard stories of injustice, understood that the same nation capable of such generosity was also capable of great cruelty. But they also saw something that their ideology had insisted was impossible, that a society built on freedom and abundance could be not only prosperous but compassionate. That strength did not require brutality. That victory did not require dehumanization. In the end, the war was won by industry and strategy and the blood of millions. But the peace, the fragile, imperfect peace that followed, was built on smaller moments, on gestures of mercy that cost nothing and changed everything, on nurses who sang when they did not have to, on prisoners who wept not because they were broken, but because they were, for the first time in years, allowed to be human. December 24, 1944, Camp Rustin, Louisiana. 4 voices singing in the darkness, 200 men weeping in reply. This was not the moment the war ended, but it was the moment, for some, that the possibility of peace began. Still nacht, heilige nacht, silent night. Holy night, all is calm, all is bright. And in that fragile calm, in that impossible brightness, something new was born.